Our next discussion is animism, sometimes called Spiritism or shamanism. It's really a label for a very broad category of different localized beliefs and a belief in various spirits, various magical forces, the forces of nature, a kind of a polytheistic, but not even really theistic, almost pantheistic as well, kind of a broad view or broad category of people trying to control nature or trying to control the world by finding out the spiritual or kind of magical tricks in order to manipulate their reality. Let me give you first a definition of animism. And I'm taking this actually from Wikipedia. I thought it was a very helpful, simple summary, kind of long, but to give us an overall vision of what animism says. It's the belief, or this is helpful, the beliefs. So it's a very broad set, a very broad category of different approaches. That all material phenomena have agency. Okay, maybe a mouthful of words there, but that every physical thing is kind of an agent or almost has a mind or has its own personality. That there exists no hard and fast distinction between the spiritual and the physical or material world. That soul or spirit or sentience, that means like consciousness, thinking, exists not only in humans, but also in other animals, plants, rocks, geographic features such as mountains or rivers or other entities of the natural environment. Water sprites, vegetation deities, tree sprites, spirits, etc. Animism may further attribute a life force to abstract concepts such as words, true names, or metaphors in mythology. So if you look about you and you talk about trying to appease the spirit of the river, or make sure that the god of the sky, or make sure that the spirit of that tree over there is not troubling you and causing problems for you. That's a form and expression of animism. The second paragraph here is my own attempt to summarize this in a very short form. Animism is a broad label for a general pattern of localized beliefs in magic, spirits, or supernatural powers for controlling the physical world. And the notion of this goes then, it's really the desperation to try to find some kind of solution for how I can handle the physical world around me. What do I do in order to handle the painful reality that life is really hard and that problems happen? And when these problems come, I'm trying to understand, or I'm trying to resolve why they happened and how I can do something about it. I'm going to start off with a set of ideas here that I'm taking from Dr. Mark Lehman. I found this grid very helpful, and I'll return to this grid later. It's a concept that we will contrast. I will contrast how Scripture would handle these concepts. But I'll start out with three basic elements of the universe, or let's just say elements of our experience in the world. We enter the world and pretty quickly we grasp something like this. Okay, myself. Who am I? The reality of who I am. In relationship to God and in relationship to the world. And those three elements together then, depending on how you configure your understanding of the universe or your understanding of the world, you will then format or formulate your religion. Your religion or your worldview is going to grapple with these three realities and different answers to the question. Maybe you might even try to deny that there is a God in the first place. That's an answer to the question. Who is he? What is he? Well, he doesn't exist. How do you view the world? How do you view the world in relationship to God? How do you view yourself in relationship to him and to the world? And I'll start with animism. I'm going to talk about how we would configure these three elements within an animistic framework. And what you'll end up with is something like this. Okay, now let me explain what I mean. The basic notion of animism is I'm born into this world and it's messy and it's painful and it's really difficult to control. Bad things happen, people die. People get sick, poverty happens. All kinds of suffering happens. And so I'm looking about me in the world and I'm trying to figure out, how do I handle this painful existence that we call life? What do I do about it? How do I manage all of this? It's hard. It's really hard getting about in this world. And as I then look around me to try to find a solution, one of the possible solutions I might come up with is the idea that I can dominate or somehow control my world, or at least keep it under management, keep it under wraps so that at least it's manageable enough, if somehow I can recruit God to become part of controlling my world. And that's why I've put here God in a much smaller format. There is a sense within animism that God is, or these spiritual forces are greater than us, and that they are more powerful than us, something to be feared. But there is underneath it an underlying concept that I need to figure out how to harness those spiritual powers, recruit them. I've got to figure out how to get them on my side so that then I can figure out how to manage the reality about me. I'm trying to figure out what are the little tricks or what are the methods in order to recruit spiritual forces and spiritual powers in order to avoid pain, sorrow, poverty, suffering, and ultimately death. If then I was going to summarize some of the concepts of Spiritism or of animism, I would say something like this as a summary. First of all, the goal is ultimately pragmatic. The goal is not necessarily to understand the realities, definitely not to worship a God who is worthy of our love. Most of the expressions of animism or spiritism have very unworthy spiritual forces. I mean, very negative and unappealing spiritual forces. You remember the graphic that I started off with earlier today. It hardly appeals to you as a God that you want to worship and that you want to have a relationship with. What if this is the expression of your God? See. And where we're talking then about animism, we're talking about spiritual forces that mostly are to be feared. Mostly we're talking about spiritual forces that you want to stay away from if possible. You only come to them when you really, really have a need. And mainly your goal is to keep them from harming you. The assumption is mainly they are negative. If they would stay out of your life in general, things are going to be better off. And the goal then with all of that is to say, it is not worshiping a God who is worthy of our love. It is really ultimately trying to find a way to control outcomes. I'm trying to find methods or little tricks in order to get what I need out of this God. Related to that, the method is ad hoc, not maybe a very helpful way of expressing it, but ad hoc to say it's trial and error. It's kind of tradition passed down. You're looking for power. Sometimes that power is located in an individual. So you might have a shaman, a priest, a doctor type that you go to who has some kind of power. Sometimes that power is found in objects or foods or religious rites, rituals. And so maybe there's a charm with some kind of very scary components to it, bones from a dead person and some kind of poison from another creature. And you do some different things and you put it all together and it's all very frightful. You put it into a pouch and you wear that around your neck. And this is going to give you some sense of power or some sense of control. Okay, I have this thing. Either one of those, though, the reason I say this is ad hoc or trial and error, it's not really that people here are they're studying this in some kind of disciplined way. One of the characteristics of animism or spiritism is that it just tries stuff. And you don't really have a complete system that you've put together like a theology or something. As much as No, well, just try this. Oh, he did this. He told me this worked. Oh, that's scary. I heard that after so-and-so did this, then this happened. Right? And as such, then it's just trial and error or traditions that have been passed down. The motivation is often fear. That's a very important part of animism and spiritism, really the drive behind it. It's controlled by fear of things we don't understand. And that relates to the last. The underlying foundation is an expansive sense of mystery. Spiritism usually lacks a complete metaphysic. It's not a complete theology in the sense of a complete vision for reality or of origins or eschatology. It's more just a fearful kind of mysterious, well, we don't know what's going on here, but it sure is scary. And those kinds of concepts underlying animism are an important part of why it has its power. It has its power in people's lives and hearts because they don't really understand it. They fear it. Now, two basic concerns that I think are underneath here within animism, or things that people are thinking about when you encounter an animist, what's going on in their minds, what are the concerns that are actually driving the choices that they're making. And the two concerns I would propose are, number one, why do bad things happen? Why does someone get sick? Why does poverty happen? Why does someone die? We're looking at those kinds of things where I think in many other approaches, or we'll just say in many other contexts, maybe a Western context, someone might say, oh, it just happened. You know, reality is like that sometimes. Things break, people get old, sickness exists. It just sort of happened. And there's not really a reason for it, especially. Why? I don't know. You just got sick. But within an animistic framework, there's an assumption. No, there's a reason. Underneath this, they would reject the explanation that things just happen. No, someone put a curse on you. You wouldn't get sick unless there was some other evil force out there somewhere. And so we're going to look around, and we're going to find some kind of witch or some kind of enemy or some kind of thing you did wrong. Maybe you stepped on the wrong thing, you went in the wrong place, you went into some sacred area that you shouldn't have gone into, and it's because you did some of those things, that created the curse that then you're experiencing now. And therefore, it's not just that it merely happened, but we need an explanation for it. And closely related, what then do we do to avoid those negative events? If those things are around us, there must be an explanation or a reason for them. And if there is a reason for them, there must be a way to control them. Animism then spends a lot of time trying to find a method or a right or an action that we can do in order to control some of this, so that then we don't face the suffering or the pain or the struggle of reality on planet Earth. A point I would like to make here before I move on. Based on what I've described so far, even when I talk about kind of a charm that you might have, or sometimes you will hear someone wants to put a curse on someone else, so they make a little doll that represents that person. They poke pins into it, or they might burn the little doll in fire, or whatever they do to this little doll then represents the person, or they use some scary words or different, just dramatic materials, old bones from a dead person, and things like this that are all a way of bringing mystery and fear and horror in. When we hear those kinds of things, we're tempted to look at that and I guess honestly feel a little bit demeaning, particularly to groups besides our own. To say something like, oh, this is primitive, this is pre-scientific or non-scientific, this is primitive and crude, and in that to be dismissive of it as though we are better than that. Now, I am entirely dismissive of it. I will talk in a little bit about the fact that there are some truths in animism that people are recognizing. You'll see the framework that I have for that. They are onto something. They have correctly identified that there are spiritual powers in the world. But particularly in post-Enlightenment cultures, in cultures that pride themselves for being scientific, then we look across and we would look down on such people. I just want to highlight before I keep going that this is not just a primitive kind of reality. I would argue that every group has some kind of expressions like this that are actually kind of parallel or echo some of these notions of Spiritism. For instance, you will find expressions of a kind of superstition with basically every people group. Any culture or group of people I've gotten to know, they have some kind of expression of things they do. Not everyone, but certain people within the group will do certain things, and they do that in a way that's basically a superstition or a kind of Spiritism or Animism. I'll give you a couple of examples here. I was looking to find examples of this, so I searched for Mother Earth, and this was the first hit that came up. This is Nancy Pelosi. She is an American politician. She's actually currently the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So she's a very significant politician and would be in line to the presidency. If the president and the vice president died, she would be the next. Okay. So she's a very powerful politician. There was a time when there were some hurricanes and some other disasters, and she commented, "Mother Earth is angry. She's telling us," whether she's telling us with hurricanes on the Gulf Coast or fires in the West, whatever it is, she's telling us that the climate crisis is real and has an impact. Now, I want to be very fair here. I'm not saying that Nancy Pelosi believes that there is a spirit Mother Earth somewhere out there and that we could like travel there to talk to Mother Earth or something like that. I don't know that she's using it as a metaphor. But at the same time, the way that the metaphor is being used, it really is starting to sound something like more than just metaphor. Mother Earth is telling us something. Mother Earth is angry. I mean, you've created kind of a personality. And the further you go with this, the more it actually starts to sound like a kind of, not just a metaphor, but a kind of being that's out there. Mother Earth becomes a personality that reacts to us in anger. Other things that occur to me, and I'm going to use here an American context because it's a context I know. But wishbones, there's a funny tradition here where when you eat a chicken, there's a Y bone, and you can go on both sides and pull on it. It's even, and so it'll split. The bottom part of it will go one way or the other way. And the idea is you make a wish. Make a wish before you pull on the bone, and whoever gets that side is kind of the lucky person who gets their wish. Or sometimes on their birthday, when they'll blow out candles, make a wish before you blow out the candles. Do people take this seriously? A little bit. I think some of the concept of Santa bringing gifts to children who are well behaved, I understand that the parents are just trying to control their kids. But some of this kind of, think about the idea of a Santa who watches everything you do and he knows what you're doing. And he knows when you're sleeping, when you're awake, he knows your thoughts, he knows everything you do. That's almost kind of like a divine something. Horoscopes are a major form of this. People take horoscopes seriously. They'll say, well, I don't really believe it that much, but they read it. And if they get a bad horoscope, they will change their behavior because they're afraid of it a little bit. A concept that I hear a decent amount in Western context is karma, kind of an idea, well, I did something bad and then later on something bad happened to me. That was my karma. And in all of these, I would say, yes, when you talk to people about it or you ask them, do you really think there's a Santa? Is there really a Mother Earth as a thing that actually exists? Or does it really matter whether you made your wish or not? Does your horoscope make a difference? I think everybody will say, oh yes, that's just harmless fun. I mean, I don't really think those things are true. Not really. It's just I don't know, it's just a silly thing we do. I would argue, anytime you actually change your behavior based on one of these concerns, I would argue it has become a belief. In other words, if you look at your horoscope and you see something and you don't like what it is, and therefore because of that maybe you're going to be a little bit more careful that day. I mean, you read the horoscope and it said, be careful of accidents today or something. And so that day you try to drive a little more carefully, or you watch out for something as you're going about. If you actually change your behavior, I think you believe it. And if you do, and to that extent, I think what we're looking at here is an expression of a kind of spiritism, kind of a superstition. All people, everywhere, all societies, are concerned with the problem of needing to control their worlds. Okay, so a lot of post-Enlightenment or more scientifically oriented cultures will answer the problem of the reality around them with scientific explanations. So why did lightning strike? Well, it had to do with building up of charges between clouds and the earth, and those charges need to balance, and so lightning struck. So there's a scientific explanation, and I would say that that's a more sufficient or better explanation than saying something like, well, it was because the sky god was angry. So, okay, there's a lot of value, and I do think it's superior to give a scientific explanation like that. Let's say at least it definitely works better because you can actually learn to do things technologically, and it's a more sufficient explanation. But my question would go further. Within a scientific worldview, do we understand the underlying realities? No, I don't think we do. And to that extent, I think what we're doing here really is something that is not entirely disconnected to what we would see in animism. In animism, you just try stuff. Do this, do this, do this. Oh, that worked. That must be it. To some extent, that's all we're doing. In science, do we understand the underlying realities? No, we're just doing the best we can based on what we try and how it works. And we have then more similarity, I think, than we would be willing to admit between, sometimes, what we would call more sophisticated cultures and what we see in animism. So what are you going to do then? How are you going to interact with someone who is caught up in Spiritism or animism? How would you address them, and how would you help them apologetically? I'll start with this. Similar to what we've talked about in other discussions, it won't really work to ridicule them. You can come in and mock and, hey, has it worked for you before? And why do you think it would work? Why are you poking pins into a doll? Okay, you can ridicule. All you're going to do is give them the sense that you reject them. That's particularly true if you're working cross-culturally. And I think for most of us, that would be one of the main ways we might encounter animism. Even, let's say, you maybe grew up in the city, and then you go out to minister, and you go to a place further out where some of these things are still being practiced. And even though you might be within the same country and even within the same general culture, there's a sense of, oh, well, you're from the city, that's why you reject what we're doing. And so just to ridicule is going to give the sense that you reject them. I would say instead, even though the beliefs and the views of such people don't make sense to us, and actually they just don't make sense, really, it's better that we would set out a theological framework and address them on the level of recognizing some of the concerns they have, and that there are some truths here that they're grappling with. Okay, so I'm going to start with this, and I'm going to recognize that animism or Spiritism has grabbed onto a few truths that are actually legitimate and valid ideas. Here's a first. The physical world is not all that exists. See, what I said earlier, we're tempted in a kind of a scientific or a scientifically oriented post-Enlightenment framework to mock something like this. Oh, well, it's not the sky god sending down lightning because he's angry. It just has to do with a charge and a disparity between positive and negative charges that needs to balance out. Okay, fair enough. But pause for a second and recognize that in its own way, more modern or scientific approaches are missing a really big, obvious reality, which is the attempt to try to pretend that all that exists is the physical world, that's kind of absurd. It doesn't really work. Remember my argument earlier that secular materialism just takes what we have and you kind of find scientific ways of manipulating things, but you haven't understood the underlying realities. You haven't even bothered answering questions like, where did the world come from in the first place? Why is there anything rather than nothing? Or what will happen at the end? Or is there a life after this life? You just don't even bother answering those questions. I would say that's really foolish and bad. That's a very insufficient worldview. You don't have any answers to that question? And animism or spiritism, by contrast, would recognize that there has to be more than just the physical world. There are deeper, and I would say darker realities standing behind all of this. The physical world cannot explain itself. It's not enough. There has to be more to it than just that. Second concept, the world is a fearful place where horrible things happen. And they seem to happen meaninglessly. Animism looks at that and says, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that somebody would be born and live and exist, and I see them and I interact with them. They're a person and they have thoughts and feelings and desires, and then they're just gone. What? You're telling me that person just vanished? That doesn't make sense. And you know what? They're right. It was not supposed to be this way. Again, what I'm arguing here is that from a kind of a materialistic or scientific kind of explanation, that we would just say, oh, well, people die. Oh, things just happen. I want to ask, is it really a better answer to just accept that these events are utterly meaningless? Right? I understand, okay, so I got a cold this week. Well, why did I get a cold? Who cursed me in order that I got a cold? And the answer is pretty simple. Well, somewhere along the way, I breathed in a germ. And the germ spread, and I got a cold. That's it. It's not really much more complicated than that. But in fact, the Christian worldview doesn't just leave it at that, as to say, well, all of reality is basically just meaningless then. The Christian worldview would say, no, actually, yes, germs float around, but the world was not made to be like that. So it actually is not meaningless. The world is like this. Sickness exists because of sin. Because the world was broken through Adam's rebellion. And the world then is under a curse. See, it is actually meaningful, even if the particular events of it are basically random. And finally, or thirdly, the brokenness of the world actually has a deeper and fuller explanation. The brokenness of this world is not accidental or random. It's very much personal. And it's a problem of broken relationship. And that is because there is a powerful being. There is a powerful being that is greater than the world, and he is not happy with us. And in that sense, Spiritism has grabbed onto something legitimate. This is actually the case, where Spiritism would assume somehow the ancestor or the ancestors or the spirits are angry with us. And so we've got to appease the evil spirits in order to keep things in order. That's broken, but they've actually grabbed a right truth, which is that there is a spiritual being. And this is not just random, but that spiritual being, God himself, holds us accountable, and he is not pleased with the realities of how we have lived. That then takes me to talk not just about the spiritual truths, but I want to talk about the theological distortions. In other words, I've so far pointed out that there are some ideas that animism has correct. But I want to talk now about the ideas that animism has distorted or that animism is misunderstanding. And here they are. First of all, the spirits are not connected to material things, the spirit of the rock, the spirit of the tree, the spirit of the river. Nor are these the spirits of the ancestors. That's a major concept across animism, is the idea that the ancestors died and then I've got to please the ancestors. If not, the ancestors will come back and create problems for me. But the concept is not that the spirits or the ancestors are angry, but the biblical notion of this, we're talking about something deeper and thicker. We're talking about demons. There are evil spirits, and they are a problem, and they do create sorrow. But those evil spirits are personal beings called demons. A couple of passages that explain some of this. 2 Corinthians 4:4. The God of this world has blinded the minds of those that do not believe, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ should shine upon them. Ephesians 2. In time past you walked according to the course of this world, the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now works in the children of disobedience. Ephesians 6. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. That's referring to demons. And you realize the strength with which Paul is saying that. His idea in that goes that as you and I struggle in our Christian lives, we're tempted to think, oh, I'm struggling against that person, or I'm struggling against that religion. We're actually struggling against demons. 1 Peter 5:8, be sober, be vigilant. Your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walks about seeking whom he might devour. And one of the theologians or apologists that has talked about this extensively just pointed out that much Western thinking, and Western thinking infects all of us, much Western thinking has a problem with what he called the excluded middle. And what he means by that is, on one side, we recognize the reality of the physical world, and we recognize the spiritual reality. I'm talking Western Christian thinking. We recognize the spiritual reality of God and eternity and life after death and salvation. Okay, so we recognize some of that. Here's science. Over here is God and reality, eternal reality. And Christians handle those two sides pretty well. The problem is the middle of it. We do sometimes forget that there is such a thing as Satan and demons, and that this is real. And we would rather just kind of ignore that. In fact, a lot of the things in this area, we would just push that off and give a strictly scientific explanation. Let me pause a little bit here, and I'll return to this idea later, but practically speaking, how would you help someone who is talking about animism or who is bringing some of these things to you? I've had people come to me in different contexts I've been in and give me things that I find improbable. I'm thinking of an occasion where I was standing with someone in Zambia, Southern Africa, and the person said that he had gone out and there had been a crocodile who was actually a person, and he would change forms. He would change from being a person and change into being a crocodile. And he would go out and kill animals, and then in the morning he would change back into a person and come into his shop. And I found that really improbable. I don't really think that was going on. And I've had lots of other stories like that told to me. But how did I deal with him? You know, I could be tempted to say, is that really scientific? Does that really make sense? Can you prove that? Do you have any pictures? Do you have any video? Do you have any clear way of showing me how that's true? I could go that direction, but I would encourage you, as you might work with somebody, instead of just dismissing what they said, you just listen. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to say that they're right. You just kind of listen. But now what you're going to do is take them to some of these realities, biblical realities. The reality is actually there, that there are spiritual forces and spiritual powers, and they're real. They do actually exist. I don't know that this crocodile thing was actually happening, but there are spiritual forces that exist, and it's a real notion. But theologically then, it's going to be important to point this out. Who is in charge of those spiritual realities? Who is actually in control? And my second big idea then here is that the spirit beings or the spirit forces have no power in themselves, and they are not equal with God. In fact, they are created by God. And critically, they can only act within the limits that God himself grants. Okay? They are created, and God tells them how far they can go. They only act within the limits that he gives. I can give strong biblical support for that, and there's quite a bit of scripture that emphasizes this. For instance, here, Colossians 1:16, for by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth. Watch, visible and invisible. So the physical world and the spiritual world. Thrones, dominions, principalities, or powers. We immediately read that and I think assume that we're talking about like kings and governors. But look at it in context, visible and invisible. And the language of dominions, principalities, and powers is used in Ephesians also to refer to something more. Spiritual powers. All of those were created by him and for him. God created angels. God created the world. It's all his. It's all his creation, and he's in charge of all of it. What does that look like in actual practical application? Well, Job, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Sons of God is a way of referring to angels. Satan came also among them. Satan reports to God because God's in charge. The Lord said to Satan, where do you come from? Satan answered and said, from walking up and down. God is demanding an answer from Satan. The Lord said to Satan here, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only upon himself put not forth your hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. What we're talking about here is Job. And I'm just wanting to point out here, God says to Satan, you may do this. You may affect or you may influence his possessions. Don't touch him. God tells Satan up to this point and to that point only, you may go no further. That's all you're allowed to do. And it's the illustration, as I'm saying here, that it is very much under the power of God. God tells demons, God tells Satan what they may and may not do, because God is in charge. Other passages that do this, Luke 8:31, when he casts out demons, the demons begged him, Jesus casts out demons. They begged him that he would not command them to go out into the deep. There was a herd of pigs there, and they begged him that he would allow them to enter into the pigs. You see what's going on. Demons ask Jesus for permission. Please don't do this to us. Please, can we go over here instead? He says yes. Okay. The demons have to obey what Jesus says. It is not God and Satan. It is not equal, as though they are on the same plane and sometimes God wins and sometimes Satan wins. It is very much God created everything. Satan and the demons are underneath his control. And one more illustration of that, Revelation 20. I saw an angel coming down from heaven having the key of the bottomless pit, a great chain in his hand. He laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil, Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. He cast him into the bottomless pit. He shut him up. And the requirement here, he set a seal upon him that he would deceive the nations no more. After that, he will be loosed a little season. I would like to point out here, first of all, who is binding Satan? The answer is it's an angel. I mean, I think that's really interesting to say. It's not as though the only person who can bind Satan is God. Okay, so Satan is so powerful that God comes and finally God struggles and there's a fight and God overcomes. It's not even like that. God just sends one of his angels over. When God is ready to bind Satan, it's just a matter of, send a messenger, bind Satan. And with a chain and a seal, he can't do anything. The point of it is to say, Satan is very much not at all on any level equal with God, or able to compete with God. But it is the reality that God is in control of all reality, of all things, entirely, completely, and perfectly. And therefore there is nothing to fear from Satan or from the forces of evil as compared with God and his power. And the final statement I would like to put here is the recognition that Jesus has conquered the spirits. The result of Jesus conquering them is that we have no reason to fear them now. Now, let me give one or two notions here on my way with that concept, just to make sure that we have the complete picture in our mind. Scripture is quite clear that we should be sober, careful, that in a very real sense, we should be cautious in respect to Satan. I want to be careful not to say that we should fear Satan. We shouldn't. But on the other hand, I don't think exactly then we're saying, ha ha ha, Satan, you can't touch me. It's the reality that we ought to be serious about all of this, because Satan is very skillful. He's powerful. And yes, you even find places Jesus saying to Peter, Satan has desired you to sift you like wheat. Satan was ready to destroy you, and he could have, right? And Jesus says, I am interceding on your behalf. So there is the recognition here that Satan is a fearsome force. And in fact, I would say, again, to give kind of a positive side of Spiritism, the notion that people would be afraid of the forces of darkness, well, they're right on that, apart from Jesus Christ. In other words, apart from the reality of God and His Word and His power and Jesus Christ, you should be afraid of spirit forces like this. They are powerful and they are scary, and you have absolutely every reason to be afraid. But here's the richness of the theme. Jesus has conquered those forces. The power of the cross, together with the reality of God as creator, the power of Jesus Christ crushing the head of Satan, means that then these forces are no longer something to be feared. And here are multiple passages that represent that. Matthew 10:28, fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul. Rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. I think one of the basic ideas you want to present to a person in Spiritism is that rather than fear these spirit powers, who they really ought to fear is the creator of heaven and earth who made all of that. There is a God creator who is higher and greater than any of these forces that they fear. And that God is the one that they ought to fear. Genesis 3:15 continues that idea out. Here's a prophecy far in the past, and at the fall of man, at the beginning of sin, God says, I will put enmity between you, Satan, and the woman, between your descendants and her descendant. Her descendant will bruise your head, you will bruise his heel. That's pointing far ahead to the cross, and you can see this fulfilled in Romans 16. The God of peace shall bruise Satan under your feet, which I think is making the link across to tell you that this prophecy in Genesis 3:15 is very specific. It's Jesus Christ and his victory over Satan crushing the head of the serpent. In any case, the point of it is to say Satan is a fearsome force, but he's crushed under the foot of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ victoriously has overcome Satan. You see this then giving or coming out in practical expression. Acts 16. There's a Spiritist woman here. Okay, so Spiritism you can find in the New Testament. And she's coming behind them. She had power with many visions and dreams and that kind of thing. And so she's coming behind mocking them. Paul turns grieved and he said to the Spirit, very interesting, he addresses the Spirit, I command thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And the Spirit came out that same hour. There's a longer conversation we could have here about how we as believers interact with like casting out demons and that kind of thing. I would not say that this action that Paul gave here is supposed to be representative for us, that we're supposed to do this any more than we're supposed to go around and perform healings. But I think it's significant here to notice that there are spirit forces. And notice Paul's connection here in the name of Jesus. Why? Jesus' authority over that spirit is absolute. And Jesus' authority in his name is greater than any spirit force. Romans 8:38. I'm persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, that's that Pauline language again that seems to be connected to spiritual beings, nor things present, nor things to come, nor anything shall be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord, finishing out the rest of the context. Well, I think that's very fascinating and significant. Nothing can come between you and Jesus Christ when you have relationship with him. Jesus' resurrection, Jesus was set far above all principality and power and might and dominion and every name that is named not only in this world but also in that which is to come. Principality and power, again, that Pauline language for angels or angelic powers, spirit powers. All of that power, Every type of power, might, dominion, every name and every being that is named has been set aside by the power of Jesus' resurrection. In context, the resurrection exalts Jesus above all of that, and so that these powers then leave us now with nothing to fear. Here, Colossians 2:14, a very important and interesting passage. Jesus Christ, by his cross, blotted out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. He took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. So you can see the context of the cross. And having spoiled principalities and powers, that's that language again for angelic powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them through the cross. Again, the notion is these powers are real, they exist, but Jesus has conquered them. The cross is greater. 1 John 3:8, he that committeth sin is of the devil sinneth from the beginning. For this purpose the Son of God was manifested, that he might destroy the works of the devil. So when I put all of this together, what I end up with is a very compelling theological case and a way to be able to help people like this. And we don't just come to them and say, oh, that's nothing. Don't worry about that. That doesn't exist. You know, science is going to get a better explanation to you than any of those things. Giving an explanation like that just dismisses the problem. And in fact, it did not actually correct what's in their hearts and minds. So even if they learn to ignore some of that and now think in a more scientific framework because of you, in the back of their minds, they're continuing to think this way. And in the back of their minds, they will eventually return to some of these beliefs. Far better is to give them a true theological answer. These powers do exist, but they are not equal with God. God is the Lord and the King over all, and Jesus Christ has conquered these powers. Finally, some questions that you should ask and just ways that you can interact with a spiritist. So I would encourage you, if you were having a conversation with a person like this, start here. Number one, ask questions. I'm always going to emphasize asking questions. Do you think this works? Why do you think it works? And I'm not really doing that to try to make them feel foolish as much as I want to get to the deeper concepts underneath. Why do they assume that these powers are real? Why do they assume that these powers can do something? Why do they assume that they have a way to manipulate these powers? Another passage I'd love for you to take them to would be Isaiah 44:9-20. I won't look at it for sake of time, but this is a passage where Isaiah, actually it is a bit of a mocking passage, where he just points out someone goes and they take a tree and they carve it and they do different things with the wood. They get down and they look at this and they say, it's an idol and it's God, save me. And they pray to this idol as their deliverer. And then Isaiah just points out, it doesn't really make sense because with one thing, they take the piece of wood and they use fuel in their fire and they burn it and they warm themselves and feel better. And the same piece of wood over here they call their God. Wait, what's the difference? Half of the wood is fuel for the fire. Half of the wood is a God? What? And I've used that passage before, talking to someone who was an animist spiritist type and had gods on their shelf, just to kind of highlight, this kind of doesn't make sense. I just read the passage and I got done and I asked him, so what do you think? What do you think of that passage? And he laughed. He actually thought it was funny. Because it is kind of absurd. And he recognized the absurdity of it. I think that's a worthy way, without mocking, but just to read the passage and actually let Scripture point out the absurdity of it, and then ask them some questions about it. Another major emphasis I'd like you to make is just to ask, do you have a relationship with your God? In other words, they worship these spirit beings, but do they actually know them? Or is it just a transaction of fear? A question going that you just fear these spirit beings and you try to find ways to manipulate reality so that you can be safe. No, but you ought to be able to worship and relate to a being, a God who created you. And a related question to that is just to point out whether these spirit beings are really anything worth emulating. Would you want to be like them? is this a God that you would actually want to follow? And finally, how could a God so powerful who can create the world be represented with something physical? That's the argument of Acts 17. So the physical world and physical things and rocks and trees and wood and so forth, and you're going to look at that and talk about that as the creator. It itself is physical. It can't create the world. I think pointing out some of the irony of that or the impossibility of that helps you push in the direction of recognizing that there has to be a physical creator who made the world. I'm going to go back again to our three elements. Remember our three elements that I argued are true of animism or spiritism. I'll go further and argue that these are elements in every worldview. You have to have an explanation for, or a view anyway, for yourself, for God, and the world. How do these relate? And remember, my idea here went that animism at its core, at its center, and actually so many other worldviews, look for some kind of way to control the world. I need some way to be able to avoid evil, suffering, sorrow. How do I control the world for my own benefit? Well, can I recruit God or gods? And can I find some kind of set of tricks or some kind of methods for making all of that work out? So when you put that together, you discover that God is just a method. God is just a tool. I'm essentially using him. In fact, I really could put not just the world underneath the feet of this person, but I could put God underneath the feet of this person. And what you have ended up with here is that the person is the center. The person is the big deal. The person is the major concern. The world is there, and that's something I need to be able to solve for me. And God, in fact, is just kind of a distant reality. When I need him, I'll use him. When I can't solve the problems myself, I call on him to help. He's a solution when I have a problem that's so big I can't handle it. But for the most part, I just want to find methods to control my world. And I'm going to contrast that now with the Christian view. How would you take these elements and frame them together in a Christian perspective? And I would start with this, which is just to recognize you are not so big. And you are not such a significant part of even the world. In fact, I would do a framework like this. You are just a tiny, 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 tiny element of all that is true and all that is real. Recognize that I was born, I live, and I will die, but I share the planet with another 8 billion people. And recognize that then there are people who came before me and there are people that will come after me and I will be forgotten. It's not so important. It's not really so much about me. That can be depressing. Well, then I guess I don't matter. I guess I'm irrelevant. And here's the last part of this that really brings this picture into its fullness, that there is significance for my life and yours and everything we do because of an even grander reality. The world itself is just a tiny part of everything. Because the grand reality that defines all realities is God himself. God now is the center of the world. God is the center of everything. And the universe and me, just a small reality in that grand reality, God defines reality. But to take the picture to its full completion, I do have significance. And the world does matter, and it is real and important, but for one very basic reason. My significance is in relationship to him. Because he is great, because he is holy, because he is all-encompassing, because he is wonderful and good and beautiful, because of the richness of who he is, and because I can have a relationship with that person, I find true significance. The true significance of every person is in relationship to him. God, not me, is the center of the world. And I think this theology, this framework, gives then a good starting point as you and I seek to help people entrapped in Spiritism, Animism, or even just the people around us who might not have an idol on their shelf, but still function in kind of superstitious ways. To answer to them, the purpose or the goal of life is not to figure out ways to control my world so that I can have a comfortable existence, so that I can be the center of my world, so that I can be happy, but to point them to a grander reality that there is a God who is greater than all, and true meaning, joy, and reality is only strictly in relationship to Him. Let us then be faithful and rejoice in the blessing we have of privilege with this good and wonderful God who is worthy of praise and with whom we have a relationship. And in that then, let us rejoice at the meaning He gives us as we exist in relationship to Him.